Hello, and welcome on Gelato once more. Today I'm here joined by Jon Kol from Hyperlane, a good old business partner and friend of mine, actually. How's it going, Jon?
It's so good to be here. And I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about it today, but it's still crazy to me, right? That 5 years later, we're still in each other's lives in a meaningful way. And feels good to have, good people around like yourself.
Yes, 100%. So actually, the background here is that 5 years ago, Hilma and I were still solo coding, the both of us on Gelato, V1 back then. And we already had some customers then, like Instadab was already a customer and so on. And we were raising our seed round. Previously, we started in 2019, exactly 6 years ago, and we had gotten some grants, some Gnosis and Metacartel and Lao. But yeah, back then you were at Galaxy and you found me on the internet somehow. And I remember that summer 5 years ago. And you wrote one of our
Stalking the Telegram group.
Yes,
Stalking
exactly.
the Telegram group when it had 15 people in it. And being like, well, my guess is that the admin of the Telegram group for such a small project has got to be one of the founders.
Yep. Yeah, and it was funny because I had some other angels that back then who asked if they can join the round, and when I told them that Galaxy is on board, like some of them were like, "Oh yeah, I partied with Novograds in Las Vegas" or something like this. So it was a funny thing. I wasn't aware of that whole
The scene.
dynamic, the scene exactly. But yeah, it's actually super cool that like a couple of years later you're a founder yourself working on Hyperlane. And there's actually one guy I can think of from the seed round as well, Meow. He's like the founder of Jupiter. Actually, he was an angel.
No way.
Yes, he was an angel in the seed round, and he also went on to just like found his own thing and be widely successful with it, of course.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Next time I run into him, I've got to tell him that. Look at that. Gelato seed round, not only producing a great company, perhaps inadvertently producing other great companies.
Who knows? Who knows? Yeah. So actually, what have you been up to, since you joined Hyperlane, I guess a couple of years ago? And, where did Hyperlane start and where is it at today?
So, where it started really is so I've been in crypto, I guess, since 16, personally, late 17, more professionally. And the thing that was always super interesting about it was I heard the Bitcoin pitch a bunch of times, and I use Bitcoin to buy certain things on a few occasions, but that never was a mind virus for me in a way that it is for some people. The thing that was a mind virus is I'm working at Morgan Stanley. I'm on the fixed income desk. I'm helping sell or trade bonds for different people. And in our after hours, what we're doing is we are giving the logic to the quant team that's writing the trading bot that at some point will basically take all of our jobs. And then one day I basically I learned about Ethereum, and there was this one line in the, I want to say it's in the yellow paper, that was imagine permissionless financial services being provided through these smart contracts. And I started thinking oh man, all my colleagues, they're worried about this fucking trading bot. What they should be worried about is that one day there's just going to be a program on something like Ethereum, and maybe it's called Morgan Stanley, maybe it's called something else, but that is going to figure out how to do what we do here. And honestly, that sounds like a way more interesting thing to be involved in, and perhaps a way better thing for everyone involved. And so you learn about that, you get super into crypto. It's oh my God, I gotta put everything into learning about this industry. And I don't know anyone at the time. So I was I just gotta get in as fast as I can, because by the time other people don't think this is crazy, it'll be too late. I gotta go in right now. And all right, so you have these internet computers. Anyone can access them. Anyone can do stuff permissionlessly on them. And very quickly after learning that and becoming super excited and bullish on this concept, I learned, wait, okay, so a blockchain only knows stuff that's endemic to it. If it doesn't produce that data endemically, it doesn't know anything about it. So, that's why we have things like oracles, because they don't know any information outside the blockchain. Well, what that means by extension is that chain and this chain, they can't really talk to each other. And that's when I was oh man, well, that's a little bit less exciting now, because there's going to have to be a ton of these, right? There's probably not just going to be one. Like the internet's not built on like one server in a basement somewhere, you know. Not like, so there's one South Park episode where like the entire internet is like this massive Linksys router in like some bunker. And then I thought, well, yeah, by next year they'll figure this out. Like I'm old enough to remember when I first got on the internet. I'm turning 35 next month. First time I had an internet connection, like me and my friends who were on different ISPs, like couldn't access all the same websites. Like, all right, by next year this will get figured out. This won't be a problem. Well, that was 17, and then it's 18, and then it's 19, and then it's 20, and then it's 21. And it still kind of like felt like an open question. And so late 21, a few friends came together. You know, a very good friend who maybe I won't name to like spare her the hassle, but she was like, hey, there's this, you know, I'm having some discussions with like a really interesting group of people. Like, you should come join us. And those discussions, you know, one thing led to another, and before you know it, like it's early 22, and we're kind of starting a new company. And that today is the thing behind Hyperlane. And it was just premised on this idea of like, okay, so we're starting to get some solutions for how these chains are going to connect with each other. But shit, I believe there's going to be so many of these chains. It's not going to happen all at once. It's going to take time. But the idea that like, if I want to get onto all these chains, I need to go to somebody and ask them to do it for me. And I need to wait on their timeline. I need to like do all those things. It didn't sound like that's going to work. And so I wanted to have something that would let anyone kind of connect any chain and, you know, do it on their terms, be able to use the tooling for this thing. And that's kind of what informed Hyperlane, and that's how it started 3 years ago. Now you asked, what have we been doing like since then? Well, I'd say one of the most interesting things that we've been doing, and this is why it like feels so cool to me to, you know, even be having this conversation with you, is, you know, you mentioned, hey, so before Hyperlane, for instance, I was running the investment team at Galaxy, you know, Michael Novogratz's firm. I was doing it with my partner, Michael Jordan, who today runs DBA, which is an investment firm that a bunch of people may be familiar with. And, you know, got to back amazing things like Gelato. But the fact that, you know, 5 years later, not only are we, you know, still good friends, it's that Hyperlane is becoming, right, like something that can be used by Gelato. And some of the more exciting pieces of work that we've done, I would say, is things like seeing Hyperlane basically be, you know, built in more directly into new rollup stacks, like what you've done with Abundance. And so probably, if I think of like some of the work streams this year, that type of work stream has been like one of my most favored of the recent months, but there's a bunch more that we can talk about. And, you know, I feel like I've been talking for like 5 minutes. I'm going to stop myself now.
Yes, so let's jump into maybe the technical sort of part of this podcast, where we sort of try to explain what are the technical nuances, or, you know, the main things to know about Hyperlane, what it is. And, you know, we don't have to do like explain like I'm 5 here. I think this is a fairly technical audience, so we can jump straight, like go straight to the meat of it. The way I would look at Hyperlane is it's a cross-chain sort of a modular, a very important word here, a modular cross-chain messaging or cross-chain interop protocol, meaning that you have smart contract components, and then you have off-chain agents, off-chain components, like validator nodes and relayers. And the idea is to sort of combine them, and then you essentially you can build what you call warp routes. So you can build connections or routes between chains, and these connections are essentially unique per token, per configuration. So Hyperlane is hypermodular, meaning that you, as a developer, like, I think this is where Hyperlane really is the most distinct and differentiated from your approach early on, is like you want to enable developers with open source technology in a permissionless way to essentially just build it themselves, lay all the pipes themselves between chains for tokens that they want to move across their application. and then potentially later they can join, joint, modules or joint routes, or be added to routes with their tokens. But it's the idea is with Hyperlane, you can really start yourself on the weekend just by yourself. You don't have to talk to anyone to make it work if you know how to code and deploy some stuff.
And that was, what's funny is today you don't even like. I don't know how big you are into the surface of AI tooling, but as someone who like hasn't like ever coded professionally and kind of like stopped coding as like a call it something that I spent substantial amounts of time on like over a decade ago, now using the AI tools, big fan of Cursor, regular user of like the reasoning models from like OpenAI, or I really love the new Gemini release. It's very good. Highly recommend it. You don't even need what you need is more like the systems thinking, but you don't even need like the raw coding ability. Like the AI tools are now like good enough that you can basically like sick it at the Hyperlane repo in the docs, and like you could just run through it. It was pretty incredible, like how good these tools are that you can do this today. I was like very pleasantly surprised after messing with them.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like Gelato was pretty much my first professional coding project. And I loved coding. Actually, my username still is on Telegram, and used to be on X. It used to be Git Pusher. Yes, indeed. That was how I was known back in the day. But I had to rescind that name because it's just been too embarrassing to look at my Git commit history. But it's crazy. Like for me, I was learning how to code like a caveman, and that's like a couple of years ago. And
dude, I think just like what 6-7 years ago, and the world
exactly.
entirely different today.
I mean, even like 3-4 years ago, I was still coding sometimes, right? And that feels like it's completely different now. Back then I was browsing Stack Overflow and like sort of gluing stuff together, right? But now it seems like completely different. What I'm seeing in the team with Cursor and vibe coding and everything. So I would love to try it out. I would love to try it out.
Highly recommend it. I'm kind of pushing a lot of our people towards like just using these tools wherever they exist. And one topic maybe if we have time we'll get to is like what I anticipate as like the upcoming dispersion between the teams who figure out how to use these tools really well and the teams who don't. But before we do that, I owe the listeners, it's like, what is Hyperlane? I thought you gave like a very good overview. And I guess like high level, what does a messaging protocol do? I boil it down to like 3 different components. And in some protocols, these components are like all mixed together, and sometimes it's only 2 components instead of 3. But there are 3 things that a messaging protocol, in my view, needs to do. And in the case of Hyperlane, they're all distinct. The first one is like you need some on-chain interface, something like an on-chain API for a developer to interact with. And so in the Hyperlane case, this is the mailbox. This is the thing that you send messages to, and that messages are received on any single or combination of destination chains. And so, like what does the mailbox do? You pass a message into it, you tell it where does the message need to go, you encode, the call data that you want to arrive at that destination, or sorry, it encodes that call data for you. That's the first component. The second component is like, well, hey, it's great that I can send something between chains, but how is it secured? And so before Hyperlane, what was very common is that people tightly coupled like these first 2 components together. They didn't really think of the fact that, well, what people want, what developers want is to be able to connect between chains, as that's like the product experience that they're looking for. But because security was so impactful, and it's so impactful still today, they put those things basically like and made them inseparable. And so there was no notion of like passing a message that is distinct from how that message is being secured. Well, we had the realization that actually that doesn't have to be this way. Like there's no good reason for why you can't decouple those things. Like on a technical basis, you could totally decouple them. And so we did. So the second component for Hyperlane are the security modules. And in the case of Hyperlane, if you run into the docs, you'll encounter this acronym a lot, ISM. It stands for Interchain Security Module. And the ISM really is just like a wrapper on some logic that makes you feel comfortable with the state that you're reading from another chain. And so it can be anything that provides a state attestation. Think like a system of validators, whether they have stake behind it or not. They're just providing state attestations. Or it could be something like a state proof, right? We are getting better and better state proving systems, mostly on like the ZK front. Well, anything that provides a state proof for, right, like the state of a mailbox on a given chain can be used as a verification mechanism. Just someone needs to wrap it as a Hyperlane module, and you're good to go. And some people have already done that. And so as these tools become, as these ZK proving systems become better and better and better, meaning the proof time shrinks, the proof cost shrinks, those will allow them to be more performant and on par with, call it like the attestation-based systems. But we really like that flexibility because the system is decoupled. It means like if you're running on Hyperlane, you can have your integration, and then you could start with an attestation-based, like some validator-based module. Hey, a year down the line, suddenly like there's a ZK module available. You find that it's just as fast, just as cheap as whatever you're used to. You're just switching modules. You don't need to rip apart all your integration and like start over or look for a new provider. Switching modules, basically just pointing from one contract to another, and now you've upgraded your security with minimal effort. So very into, obviously we're biased, right? Like we wouldn't have designed a system if we're not like super into and super high conviction and like this is a great way to do it. So I guess the audience can take it with a grain of salt. And the third component is like relaying. How does okay, so you sent something on one chain, like how does it, and you found a way to secure it, how does it actually reach any destination, right? If you think of systems that do this without relaying or do some form of like basic self-relaying, you can look at like the optimistic bridges. When you withdraw normally from, say, Optimism or Arbitrum, like through the main rollup bridge, well, it's a multi-transaction step. Forget the like 7-day latency. Even once that's done, you need to go on Ethereum L1 and you need to like make your claim transaction. That's because there's no relaying there. Nothing submits that transaction on your behalf. So think of the relayer kind of like a keeper bot that observes the mailboxes on all the chains you want it to connect. And it sees, oh, Luis is trying to send something from Solana to Base. Cool, I see that he's got enough to pay for gas. I also see that a security module on Solana has attested as verified that Luis's transaction is valid. Sick. I'm going to process that transaction on the mailbox on Base on Luis's behalf. What does that mean? Now you get charged in Solana, the gas token you already have because you're on Solana, instead of having to facilitate like, well, where do I have ETH, where do I have like Arbitrum on, ETH on Base to pay for gas? Like that's abstracted from you, and now that just happens. And so those are the three like components. That's the basics on like how does Hyperlane work? A message is sent by a developer to the mailbox, a security module. The developer can either run one on their own or they can use one that's already running on that chain. Observes that mailbox, sees the message, signs off on it. Relayer sees that all of those things have happened. The message has arrived at the mailbox. It has been signed off. Now it submits the transaction on the user's behalf into the mailbox on the destination chain. And before you know it, it's been 30 seconds from when you initiated that transaction, and boom, lands on Base, and you're good to go about your business. So let me know if I missed anything, because obviously for people who don't know, Luis is very familiar with the Hyperlane design.
Yeah, no, I think that helped a lot, and actually let me expand on that. So I think what helps in general navigating the space of interop or bridging, cross-chain messaging is very hard because there's many different words to describe different things or the same thing. Like, for example, people often conflate cross-chain messaging with bridging, and they can be the same if cross-chain messaging is applied to bridging, but they can also be different if we're talking about like a liquidity provider, like market making type bridge, which is more like a swapping thing than it is a cross-chain sort of message.
You run
message
into this
transfer.
all the time.
Yes, so there's a lot of confusion about this. I would say Hyperlane, first of all, it's important to understand Hyperlane is operating at a lower level of the stack than, for example, the across application would be operating at. Many people are, for example, are familiar with across or relay or Stargate or something like that, which are token bridges. But often they are a bit like at a higher level of an application, and they essentially are an application for swapping tokens cross-chain or something. But what Hyperlane technically can be used for, even in these protocols, is dispute resolution, right? Like, so for example, across they abstract a lot of the cross-chain message, the need for cross-chain messaging. They famously sort of were one of pioneered this optimistic model where you just get filled and nothing, like there's no cross-chain messaging, which is for some time why they were the most efficient for like certain token bridging aspects. And again, listener, like what's most important to understand in everything is always start from the token, right? Like don't start from the chain or whatnot. Like the question for cross-chain messaging, and especially bridging, which is the most common application on top, and which is also the example that we will explain Hyperlane by, because supposedly Hyperlane is most commonly also used for bridging tokens across chains. And yeah, always start from the asset, right? Like you always have to ask yourself first, what asset do you care about? And then you ask, okay, what route, what connection do you care about? For example, moving Solana from Solana to Ethereum, right? Like you start with the asset Sol, and then you wonder how you move that Sol from Solana to Ethereum, and then you have multiple options, right? But one thing with optimistic sort of liquidity bridges like across is they are usually known for moving canonical tokens across chains. I mean, usually on Ethereum, between Ethereum main chain and the L2s. And they started out with, moving USDC or even to this day ETH from Ethereum to the L2 and then between L2s. And how they do this is essentially keep liquidity pockets on all of these chains, and they fill you from this liquidity, which is a market making operation. It's capital intensive. They could run out of liquidity, at which point they have to inject fresh liquidity. And they essentially abstract all of the pain around rebalancing and keeping their inventory in all these chains to be able
they
to
do an
fill.
incredible job. Just right,
Yes.
like that. You at the end of the day, as the user, you just like going across. Okay,
Yes.
I want to go from here to here, and I want to do it in this asset, and you click, and within a matter of 30 seconds, like you'll be there. When in reality, there's like all this complex stuff happening.
Yes, highly complex stuff, and like even like let's say the example of across, right? Or like a similar comparison would probably be Stargate. So even there, like this is at the one end of the spectrum of what bridging is. And this is like, now we're talking about a bridging application like token swaps and so on, using sort of liquidity provider mechanisms and protocols in the background. But even something like this, like a simple cross-chain swap, right? Like going, let's say, using across to say, hey, across, I'm going to give you my ETH on Ethereum. Therefore, I immediately want your ETH to be sent to my address on Arbitrum. This is essentially how across works, right? And this is, by the way, also how many fintechs work, like Wise and I suppose Revolut and so on. These old fintechs that sort of have instant bank transfers and so on. Often they literally have liquidity in all of these banks, and they make it seem to you as if these transfers are instant, when in reality they're just, essentially giving you a short-term credit. But yeah, so across, like even across, like, and people forget this often. And to be honest, I feel like across is almost like trying to hide this a bit. But even for something like across to work, you still need cross-chain interop and messaging to work, because ultimately what the problem that Hyperlane and any cross-chain messaging attestation protocol is trying to solve is how do you prove to one chain that the state of another chain was XYZ at some point in time, right? For example, most commonly, like in the example of across of transferring ETH between Ethereum to Base, for example, or Arbitrum, how do you so as a user you give across the money, the ETH into escrow on Ethereum, right? And now across is supposed to give you ETH an equivalent amount on Arbitrum, right? Let's say that doesn't happen. Your ETH is now in escrow,
Exactly.
waiting to be paid out to a cross after some time. There's like, it's escrowed for a reason. So now there's a challenge period where you essentially have to challenge this and say, hey, I didn't actually get my money on Arbitrum. I want my money back on Ethereum, right? And now you need a cross-chain dispute resolution mechanism, which is where something like Hyperlane would come in. I think Across is using their own mechanism, something based on their UMA optimistic oracles, which
That's right. Yeah.
is a bit questionable because you don't know too much about it, but it's a mechanism. But this is like, so even for market makers, in the eventuality of an edge case where actually there is something isn't processed correctly, then you need to fall back to cross-chain interop, and this is the sort of lower level that Hyperlane is sort of building from the ground up, right? And then like, so Across is on this one end of the spectrum of bridging, like very application specific, very sort of liquidity provider specific. And then at the other end, you have pure cross-chain messaging, which technically could be generic interop, but to be honest, most commonly we still see it being used for bridging. There used to be a lot of talk about like other cross-chain messaging use cases for like cross-chain applications and governance and so on. I think they're a bit of like a nerd.
So yeah, like not only that, dude, when if I go back like 3 years and I look at what we were thinking and what, folks like Layer Zero and XLR were thinking, and all of us really were like, the first investor deck that I made, like the key theme was, all these apps say that they want to go cross-chain and they want to do like all these like complex cross-chain flows. So we got to give them, a robust and flexible like messaging framework to use for that. And I got to tell you, it's really only like in the last 3 months, this is 3 years later, that I'm actually starting to see that type of activity pick up. And, I think that basically by the end of, by the end of 22, call it maybe early 23, basically, certainly, so there's where I'd realize like, actually 99%, maybe even like 99.9%, all people want to do now, this is both developers and the end users, does not involve like the more complex uses of like a messaging protocol. And it's just that these messaging protocols can give you a much better way to transfer the tokens around. And yeah, it's not until now, basically like call it February, March 2025, that I'm now seeing a resurgence, a small, but it's definitely there, resurgence in like, hey, I want to do, they're not even totally aware that like what they want to do is kind of closer to that idea of like a cross-chain app. They just know, well, I have contracts here and here and here, and I have users here and here and here, and I want to be able to do these like more complex things for them. And I got to tell you, like we work with, like well over 100 teams. Yeah, not until early 2025 that this suddenly became like a thing that I can point to and have like more than one example of who is thinking about doing it and who is actually like spending effort to make it happen.
Yes, and before we go into the sort of non-bridging use case, let's so basically we have Across on the one end of the spectrum, which could still use Hyperlane and in fact uses their own cross-chain messaging protocol to resolve cross-chain disputes. And then like you could also try to approach the bridging application from the other side, like let's say a pure cross-chain messaging interop. And this is where usually we will find these sort of mint and burn tokens, like you guys call them synthetic warp routes. Layer Zero has popularized them a lot. The OFTs, I'm sure many have heard of Layer Zero OFTs. And there the idea is you don't have a market maker. You basically just have an asset issuer, like a token issuer, or a token issuer working with a messaging protocol. And there the ERC20 contract itself allows for minting and burning of the token balances. And this is like a major unlock. Actually, I designed this like 3 years ago for Gelato once we moved our gel token multi-chain, because it gives you like it's max capital efficient. You don't have liquidity constraints at all. You can freely move the token for users in between chains without needing the expensive services of a market maker. And this is where like cross-chain messaging protocols are really powerful and in a way quite disruptive also to market maker token bridging models, because they can build networks around tokens and routes that like sort of at almost no cost other than the security and infrastructure cost can move token around, where a market maker has huge costs to keep the inventory,
Totally.
cost
Like
of capital, low, like
you
yeah.
know,
So
what
that's
the researcher types who like I'd say like are, you know, maybe know a lot about the research aspects of like interop, but don't, you know, they're not practitioners, they're not in it every day. What they a lot of times don't realize is that like if you're a market maker and you're good and you are in this asset class, like your hurdle rate is like 35%, sometimes even higher, right? And so what does that mean? That means that like if you're going to use your inventory for anything other than like your bread and butter activities, it's got to clear that rate. And that's super expensive. You know, when you're like, okay, wait, what's the cost of capital of like something like a warp asset or an OFT? It's the gas. It's just the gas. Versus like, oh wait, okay, so I gotta think of what do they have to make so that like their you know, their like risk adjusted return here exceeds like this level, you know. Okay, if they're not doing stables, like now something like a Sharpe ratio comes into play, and it just gets real expensive real fast. And that's why I think these, you know, messaging based models, right, like leveraging the settlement from a messaging layer, have just been like really growing in popularity over the last year or so.
yes, and I especially noticed, like I was always sure that this messaging based, like this you know, Hyperlane calls them synthetic warp routes or warp acid.
Yeah, I might have to change that name, make it more
yes,
catchy. It's not catchy enough. HFT, maybe. I don't know.
HFTs, exactly.
Yeah.
That's the one. So so yeah, so now we suddenly have a bridging application built on top of a messaging protocol via these mint and burn tokens, where the messaging protocol is the bridge and has many advantages like cost, scalability. Like this is way easier to scale to many chains, and also permissionlessness, right? Like if you're a developer with some random tokens, right, on your chain, like maybe your own gaming token, maybe meme coins, whatever it is. Good luck trying to convince a market maker to fill from their own inventory. No way they will onboard your token, right?
Yeah.
Like so you have
You're
to
gonna
loan
have to pay
it to
an arm
them.
and a leg.
Yes, you have to loan it to them. So at this point, you're suddenly making calls and then are in Slack groups, and you're not like sort of just deploying code, right? So, but of course,
pushing.
Yeah, exactly, not get pushing. So of course, then the question is, okay, what would an across or someone like this say? They would say, okay, yeah, but then the asset security, like the token security, is the security of the cross-chain messaging setup that you're using, and you're not inheriting the sort of security of blockchain assets anymore, which is only semi-true because whilst in transit, blockchains cannot natively transfer tokens amongst each other. So whilst in transit, you're always trusting some protocol. But they would probably say when holding the asset, so if you transferred canonical assets, like let's say ETH from Ethereum to Arbitrum, while holding the asset on Arbitrum, then you don't have a trust assumption anymore on the bridging protocol, right? You might have a trust assumption still on Arbitrum, the rollup sequencer. But yeah, that's usually the common argument, and I feel like there's actually I mean it all depends on, like in a way you already see in the data today that like these mint and burn tokens are massively winning, like USDC issued by Circle across chain with CCTP. That's most of the TVL, right? But it all depends on like
not only that, Louis, right? Like why I think, you know, it's that statement that they make is undoubtedly a true statement, right? Like I don't think anyone would try to argue that, but the impact of its truth and like its truth content kind of changes through time, because now that this modular design that like Hyperlane's pioneered is becoming like more and more accepted. Well, like you can bring in the chain's trust assumptions into the process, and right, like if you think of a case where like, all right, say Hyperlane is running on like a Gelato chain that runs the abundance stack, and now like the verification can come from the stack itself, can come from Gelato itself. Well, now you're basically looking at a trust assumption that looks like, well, if I trust this chain in general, then the veracity and of the security of the transfer is the same property. And like today, when people like on Cosmos chains that have their own validator sets, like it tends to be the case that when they use Hyperlane, they basically get, you know, a significant portion of their like stake delegation. And now the trust assumption of using Hyperlane through them ends up looking a lot more just like, well, if I trust the chain in general. And I think this, in a world of many chains, this like becomes increasingly true as the number of chains increase. So, you know,
Yes. So
certainly I think we're both very bullish on this notion.
Yes, very, very bullish on this notion indeed. And I think the more chains there are, the more simply like it's an insurmountable problem at some point to make markets across all of these chains. Of course, I mean, nowadays it's 7-day rebalances across rollups is horrible, but like maybe ZK can help a little, but at some point it's still,
and
like,
it's honestly, it's not even that. It's like, so I think of this as not different from the case of like, why was the AMM model that, you know, Uniswap, you know, maybe didn't exactly invent, but certainly was like the, you know, first player to make real waves with. Like, why did that work out really well? Well, because there was this large group of assets at the time that exchanges didn't really want to list and market makers didn't really want to trade for the reasons you mentioned, right? Like they, you know, they're a business. They're in it to make money. They're trying to do their best to generate the most profit while minimizing their risk at any given moment. And so, like, can they hold, you know, say they have $1 million portfolio, can they hold 70% of it in a mix of like long tail assets? Probably not. Well, the market was very interested in buying those things, despite the fact that there was not like enough, you know, neither venues to trade on in terms of exchange not wanting to list and people making to basically take up all that taker volume because market makers didn't want to trade those assets as much. And so in comes in Uniswap and it lets anyone create a market. And yeah, you know, it was more volatile, right? Like, you know, the slippage concern, sandwiching, all that. It didn't stop it. I think I saw a tweet from Hayden the other day that was like, oh, Uniswap just cleared like some absurd number, like possibly that it was like $1 trillion. I don't know, but that's just like obscene. It's crazy to think about. Like, you know, so many people were like, this will never work. Well, turns out that it does work. And then, you know, through actually, funny enough, some of the work that your team has done, now you see a lot more of just major assets trading on these dexes. And so I very much think of like the proliferation of long tail chains and their assets as being very similar to what like Uniswap did in a single chain context for long tail assets. And so like market makers are probably not going to solve this. Like I think the solution that we're talking about here is really the one that makes the most sense, that ends up being like the most cost efficient for everybody involved. And so I just don't see how it doesn't take hold. And certainly the evidence right now is for it very much taking hold.
Yeah, and I could also see it just being a question of where's the bigger market share in terms of volumes, revenue, whatever it is. And there, I think if you're bullish on like roll-up expansion, like obviously we are at Gelato and Hyperlane, right? And then you start seeing more and more that a huge chunk of the total market will be like sort of based on cross-chain messaging protocol and sort of mint and burn tokens. I still think that market makers can play an interesting role to provide fungibility. Because one of the coolest things about Hyperlane is you can, as a developer, let's say you start and you build your own like gaming ecosystem across 4 rollups, and in between there, you don't care so much about the security setup. You deploy your token there, you use your own setup for Hyperlane routing, and tokens move freely in between your gaming rollups, but it's not super secure, right? But now your gaming ecosystem or studio becomes super successful. You want to export the token to other chains, right? Now, like on these chains, suddenly you might say, okay, this time I'm not going to use my same Hyperlane synthetic sort of configuration. This time I'm going to deploy the token differently, and I'm going to connect it to my Hyperlane system via like a sort of market maker thing, or via some other type of security protocol that uses a different setup to mine, like more validators from Hyperlane, maybe a shared ISM from Hyperlane or something, right? So in there you can have these hybrid systems where Hyperlane gives you the option to start building, without permission, start, getting the product out, testing how it does, testing, like getting PMF. And then later on, you can layer or connect your token routes in heterogeneous ways. And then the question is always like, where do you need fungibility? Well, you might not be able to have it everywhere, depending on heterogeneous security concerns and constraints. But yeah, there, market maker could play an interesting role to go between, like you might have your own Hyperlane networks for the same token, depending on different security parameters across different ecosystems, and you might use a market maker to sort of go in between, right? So I think this is like super interesting, where you can be super efficient for most of the transfer volume, like between two chains, but then you have a bit more of a different like routing system for another chain, which is maybe lower volume but higher cost and more higher security for you. So yeah, totally. I think this is really great about Hyperlane. But yeah, this was a long lead up. So now I'm really interested to hear from you. How do you see the space developing? How do you factor in things like ZK for you guys, like open intent frameworks, Superchain? Yeah, is it all essentially like even or potentially Hyperlane at some point interoperating with other like protocols like layer 0? Is that even like on the menu possible?
Certainly everything is possible. Well, so actually, like one thing I want to touch on so one feature that is going to come to Hyperlane in the fairly near term, like I'd expect that this will be live like within the next month or so, is to add the ability for warp routes, especially if they're like the multi-collateral kind, to rebalance between them. So now, basically, think of the situation that you described, where now like, well, there's some rebalancing that needs to happen. The most natural way to rebalance is through some market maker. Well, with this new feature, like the route owner is going to be able to play a role in this. And it's certainly something that will be helping lots of people in doing. So like, that's one that I'm, super excited about, because it will basically let Hyperlane become, part of the story when it comes to like, well, today, if you wanted to move some USDC between, say, like Solana and Base, that's actually like Hyperlane's not really great for that, right? Like there's a way you can do it, but it's kind of like you go from one of those to one of the long tail chains, then from one of the long tail chains back to kind of circuitous. It's not very appealing. But this, call it like on-chain rebalancing, will change that. So we can talk more about that. But I think in your question there was something like really interesting there, like what's next for Hyperlane, and you have to think like whether it's ZK, whether it's call it like more ecosystem native verification mechanisms, or even collaborating with like other protocols. So if you're the listener now, like think back to something I said earlier on when I was like describing the architecture of something like Hyperlane. Well, what does the security module do? What does the ISM do? All it is really is a wrapper on some logic that gives you either a state attestation or a state proof. It was designed to be maximally flexible, really. And so as something like, call it ecosystem native verification, whether it's Superchain, I know Arbitrum is working on something not dissimilar from it. Of course, in Polygon, you have like the notion of ag layer. You can have, and in the case of Superchain, actually, like we've already demonstrated this in some like testnet capacity. And so once they actually launch Superchain native interop, we'll have this productionized. But anything that has that verification available, now you have a module that represents that verification. And now all the integrating apps have to do is, they were They were using like a validator-based module. Well, cool. All right, so I go from pointing at that contract to now I point at the other module. If you were already using the defaults, great. Presumably the defaults on those chains will switch to the now more efficient native verification, and God willing, also hopefully more secure. And the same is true for ZK. Like today, there are already ZK modules for Hyperlane in a number of places, not as much as there are validator-based ones. They just don't get enough usage because they tend to be slower and more expensive relative to the validator-based ones. But clearly, right, like the arc of technology is one of continuous reductions in cost, continuous reductions in like the cycle times of how long does it take to run a certain computation, produce a certain proof. And so once those get down, right, like once basically, you have a ZK proof for like the state of a mailbox or the state of an entire chain, that ends up looking like, say, I don't know, 60, 40,000 gas, and can be done in, say 3 to 4 seconds tops. Now that'll start looking like a lot more competitive, and I don't think we're super far from that. We might be super far from, and when I say super far, listener, think about this as like, I don't know, 3 years away. 3 years away when you're like running a protocol, like feels very, very far, right? Like the entire world can change around you in that time. So we're probably a few years away from ZK being prevalent basically on a long tail of chains. But I don't know, it feels like we're maybe 18 months away, maybe even less, from this being these types of efficient proofs, meaning low cost, low latency, just being available on some of the major chains. Maybe it'll take a little bit longer to do it on Solana because need a different architecture there. But and where those things will be, like from the Hyperlane perspective, it's just like you always want to use whatever provides the best experience. And I think of experience having as like, 3 axes. It's how fast is it? How expensive is it? How secure is it? And so, well, today, certainly, right, like they already win on the security part, but they lose on the other parts. Once it's a clear, even call it just 2 out of 3. Maybe some people will be willing to take slightly slower processing times, or same processing time but slightly more expensive. Once it's very competitive on 2 of the 3 axes, like those modules will just be there, and then the developers can kind of opt for the ones they think makes the most sense for their case.
Yes, yeah. The way, again, I would encourage to listeners to think, especially developers, to think about Hyperlane is it's really like your toolkit to start out any application project rollup that you're building with minimal costs or like maximum flexibility, right? And you can grow from there. And on the one hand, you always have to ask yourself, it's always about the token. Like I said, like you always have to think about what is the token in question that I want to send across chains. And there, I would say, broadly speaking, there's 2 options. Either it's your own token, then you're in the driver's seat and you can really design a Hyperlane system just the way you want with warp routes and everything, ultimate liquidity everywhere, right? You then essentially rely on yourself and making sure that you got a good secure setup. You can run your own Hyperlane validator. You can ask Hyperlane to join. You can ask Gelato to join and others, right? This is like the one thing. Or the other, also very common, so this is super common. Most developers, they also have a token, right? That they, now with Hyperlane, they can make sure is, available on multiple chains and with super low cost because it's just cross-chain messaging. Of course, depending on your security setup, how many validators do you want? The cost can increase a little bit because now you need to bring people on board. But this might even go away in the future with ZK ISMs, where it's literally like, you need to pay, I don't know, it's a single prover network or something like that, but that's it, right? And relay are still. So the 2 options: either it's your own token, you're in the driver's seat, it's max fun, right? Or the other very common case, maybe even a bit more common, is you need another token on your chain, and now you're suddenly talking about ETH or USDC. there you might not be in the driver's seat for so long. If you have a very simple setup, single chain connection, right? ETH from base to your chain. You can use Hyperlane. It's just a deposit box, just a single connection. You can let users deposit and withdraw from your chain. As soon as you want the same token fungible from another chain, let's say ETH from Ethereum and base, now you have issues because you might, one of the box, like the inflows and outflows of users from both chains are not going to be a perfect equilibrium. So
Totally.
you have to prepare for an edge case where one of them runs dry. And either you just let it dry out and don't care, and that would be horrible UX, or you need to solve it, at which point it becomes a bit more complex. Like you might need market making, you might need
and that's where things like those, on-chain rebalancing routes could come into play. And look, one other thing that I realized I forgot to mention from what you were asking, I was like, what about even like, working with some other like interop protocols? Well, I feel like actually not enough people know this, unfortunately, but over the last few months, we've actually done a ton of work with the Chainlink team. And this is something that, like,
yeah, it's funny because
I didn't think we would
forget, I literally forget that CCIP exists, which is crazy because Chainlink is so big on
huge,
Oracle. And somehow CCIP, I don't know what their strategy there is, but everybody, when they announced it, everybody thought, okay, they're gonna take so much market share, but they're nowhere today with it, right? Like, what's happening on that front?
Yeah. So one of the areas we've been working on together is, people obviously are very excited about things like the growth in stable coins, and of course, right, the most dominant stable coin to date has been USDT from Tether. And so we were, kind of approached over the last few months by like several ecosystems, like, hey, can we, we're like dissatisfied with the state of stable coins here. Like, can we get, something better than like our form of bridge Tether? And so, one thing leads to another. Somehow, like, we start talking to Chainlink about it, and start talking to Tether about it too. And it's like, wait, we could offer something here. Then, USDT 0 comes up, and now, right, like, that runs as kind of like its own thing. And well, what can you do that has a little bit more of like those Hyperlane principles of like, can be extended, more easily, can support like a large number of chains. And so that's led to this initiative today that's called OpenUSDT. It's a collaboration between Chainlink, Hyperlane, and also Velodrome. The Velodrome team has been great to work on it. And so you're actually going to see that expanding to a bunch more chains over the next few weeks. In some cases, replacing their existing, bridged USDT. In some other cases where like stablecoins never took off on those chains, despite the chains themselves having like a ton of activity in something like ETH or their own native token. So that was just like a funny twist of fate. Never thought that in a million years that we'd be working with one of the interop protocols on like a pretty cool interop product, but here we are. And what I'll say is they've been great to work with. I know they, we were worried. We like thought, they get a bad rap. Honestly, the people there, especially the ones that we work with regularly, awesome people. Really enjoyed the experience of working with them.
Yeah, we had the same experience working with Chainlink super early in Gelato. They were like, they were smothering us, helping us with design, marketing, everything. But if you get on the wrong side of the aisle, then things change a little bit. But I haven't, to be honest, I haven't worked with them in a long time. And even though we had a brief phase where I was a bit competitive, I think it is not like that anymore. And of course, it seems like they're doing like their own thing in the TradFi world and so on, which is interesting to watch. Definitely always, I think, a great project to watch, and cool to hear that you guys are collaborating. Yeah, so maybe to finish off the pod, like, first of all, if I didn't mention or ask you anything, what should I ask you, or have asked you? And otherwise, like, what's Hyperlane, like, what's your strategy now? Is it talking more to big asset issuers, or is it focusing on developers, which in crypto are also asset issuers, but usually more long tail?
I'd say So I guess the first one, there's a number of things, but maybe we'll do that on another time because none of them are like things that you can kind of go through in just like a minute or two. And then to your second question, it's a mix of both. Hyperlane's kind of built its credibility and reputation through like the what I like calling like the Rebel Alliance, basically like the mass of small, small chains, small apps, and then some of those growing. And so to basically do that and then to abandon those folks completely, I feel like would do, first it's like it's just not our, philosophical alignment. And then second, it just kind of feels wrong. So just going to continue to improve the tooling and the experience so that basically as many developers, small or large, have an easy time, deploying routes themselves, deploying Hyperlane to the chains that they need, etc. But there's also now more activity with, call it, mid and large sized different asset issuers. So winning on those fronts definitely is something important that we want to continue to be able to do.
Nice. And for me, one of the bull cases for Hyperlane is also just like a good question would be, would Circle CCP have used the Hyperlane open source stack if they launched today, right? They launched pretty early, and you guys were also pretty early then. But I think one of the bull cases is because, I suppose a lot of these big crypto native asset issuers, they simply would like to host on-prem. It's quite interesting, actually, that Tether with USDT 0 sort of didn't do, although they're probably involved in the DVN there. But like there could be like a bull case here where essentially the Hyperlane stack is the most audited, whatever, used code base, and then a big institution, maybe they don't want to join any like sort of public Hyperlane network, but they just take that stack and build it themselves and secure it themselves, right? But essentially still being compatible and at some point composable with the rest of the network. So yeah, I think that could also be interesting to like as a proof of concept to have the first big institution using Hyperlane without any of your sort of involvement or so, just taking it because it's the most audited, free to use code base. Essentially, I think that could be cool as well. What do you think about that?
I think well, so what I'll say is, this is a funny story. Maybe I shouldn't even say it, but I definitely think that specifically Circle, if they were doing this today, would totally use Hyperlane and would do it in a way where they are the sole proprietor of the module, which is something really cool that you can do with Hyperlane, where like you can run it and leverage kind of every part of it while completely owning your security and having no external dependency. And we talked about this idea with them, but this was 3 years ago. Hyperlane was like in its infancy, and we kind of like laid out this design and idea. A few months later, their CCI
Wormhole had just been hacked. FTX had just crashed.
Right. Yeah. And so now, how prevalent does this become? I think it'll become very prevalent. But what you'll see are two kind of approaches. One is going to be people who were the issuers, where like their compliance needs say, we actually need to be completely insulated from this. There can be no direct entity connection. And I can tell you right now, we've already been in several rounds of conversation with a asset issuer that's their assets are somewhere between, depending on the day, 4 and 6 billion in total. And for them, their compliance structure says we can't do, none of our entities can be involved in this. Like, we're happy to, support it from marketing. And I imagine that might be true for someone like Tether. But then on the other end, you have someone who like their compliance actually force them to be, involved all the way from either they need to completely run the security module, or at least be one of the parties and have like stricter, tighter control over like, oh, how can we blacklist certain assets? Do we have the ability to do that on demand? Can we set that at like regular intervals? Do we need to also be involved directly in the task of relaying? And so because every aspect of Hyperlane is like open source, permissionless, and able to be ran and operated by an external team, we do think that with some of the more sophisticated issuers with these more stringent compliance requirements, it'll end up becoming quite popular.
Yeah, I could see that happen as well. The good old, we have to run this on-prem, and compliance sort of has to sign off on it, and we don't want to work with any third parties is quite a common thing. Usually, I think in big enterprises and institutions, following local laws, right? But yeah,
Totally, yeah.
I think we can end it on this bombshell. Always nice catching up with you, and yeah, I hope you guys learned something about Hyperlane today. You should check out what we've been cooking up with Hyperlane in the Gelato docs. Gelato Hyperlane Cluster is what it's called. It's also prominently featured in our ABC sovereign rollup L1 stack, because if you launch an ABC sovereign rollup, it's different to an L2. There's no bridge, so you need a bridge if you want to connect to other chains, and Hyperlane made it super easy for us to enable that. Of course, you can also use ABC with any bridge you'd like, but we have a bespoke implementation with Hyperlane that you can use. And yeah, so check that out, and yeah, we'll be excited to watch you guys rock it this year. Congrats also on the token launch. And
thank you.
See you later, Jon.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on. This was a lot of fun.